Why was everyone laughing? The sound of it cut through the humid air of the Camp Pendleton Combatives facility, sharp, careless, and echoing off the rubber mats like ricochets. Laughter in uniform had a particular rhythm. It wasn't joy, it was judgment disguised as humor. And Sergeant First Class Ben Hawthorne had heard that kind of laughter all her life. She stood barefoot on the edge of the mat, a 54 supply clerk according to her file, just another paper pusher in fatigues. Her brown hair twisted into a perfect regulation bun, her expression unreadable, eyes tracing the patterns of movement across the mat. The Marines warming up nearby looked like carved statues, broad shoulders, heavy arms, veins crawling like wires under skin, men trained for impact, not patience. She didn't look like she belonged there. That was the point. Someone muttered something, too low to be clear, too sharp not to sting. Then came the voice that carried the joke. "Careful, she might break if someone sneezes near her," a gunnery sergeant said, and laughter followed like a wave. Hawthorne didn't react. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was calculation. Every second of ridicule was data, tone, posture, weakness, distraction. To them she was invisible, unthreatening. To her that invisibility was camouflage. A Marine training officer, Staff Sergeant Torres, stood in the center of the mat, cracking his neck like a prizefighter about to start another round. His confidence filled the room. It was the kind of energy that came from never losing in front of an audience. "Ma'am," he said with a grin that wasn't respect, "maybe watch from the bleachers. This is real combat, not logistics." The laughter returned, heavier now. It pressed against her chest, but not because it hurt. It pressed because it was familiar, the same pressure she'd felt in every room where someone decided she didn't belong. She slowly removed her ACU jacket. Underneath, the brown t-shirt clung to her lean frame, the fabric marked by a small patch on her chest, an insignia only one man in that room recognized. Brigadier General Mitchell's eyes narrowed from the platform above. He'd seen that insignia before, the Special Operations Combatives Program Instructor badge. Few soldiers wore it, fewer still were women. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying her movements. There was no hesitation in the way she folded her jacket or placed it aside. Every gesture was deliberate, efficient. He'd seen men about to enter combat look less calm. On the mat below, Torres continued his show. "All right, fellas," he said, turning to his Marines. "Let's give our Army guest a little demonstration. Nothing fancy, just show her how the Corps does close combat." Mocking grins, nods, gloves tightening. Hawthorne tilted her head slightly. Her voice, when it came, was calm, almost curious. "Sergeant, your sprawl defense leaves the inside knee open. If someone changes angle, that's a strike zone." That silence, the kind that freezes a room, fell instantly. Torres blinked, then laughed. "Appreciate the advice, Sergeant, but we train for combat, not PowerPoint." A few Marines chuckled, others shifted uneasily. She'd touched a nerve, the kind not taught in manuals. From the platform, the general spoke for the first time. "Staff Sergeant Torres." His tone carried authority and age, the kind that made rooms go still. "Let's make this interesting." He descended from the platform, his boots echoing against concrete. "Sergeant Hawthorne will take the mat. You'll choose 4 of your best. Controlled conditions. Submission or inability to continue ends it." A ripple of disbelief rolled through the Marines. 4 against 1. "Sir, that's not—" "Already cleared with the safety officer," Mitchell interrupted. His gaze cut through Torres like a knife. "Unless your Marines are afraid." Afraid. That word had power in a room full of uniforms. Torres hesitated, his pride answered for him. "No, sir." He turned, scanning the group. Ramirez, Colt, Hins, Park on deck. 4 men stepped forward. Each was tall, muscular, confident instructors, not students. Hawthorne stepped onto the mat. Her bare feet pressed into the rubber, toes flexing slightly. Her breathing slowed. Around her, the noise faded, laughter dissolved into static. She could smell the faint sting of disinfectant, hear the thrum of the AC above, the creak of bodies warming up. She wasn't thinking about the fight. She was remembering Raqqa. The sound of her M4 clicking empty. The weight of dust and blood in the air. The moment she realized survival didn't belong to the strongest. It belonged to the one who could stay calm when everything screamed chaos. That was the day she'd stopped fighting like a soldier and started fighting like something else, something primal, efficient, unstoppable. Her mind drifted further back to Detroit, to the smell of old wood and cigarettes in a foster home that wasn't home, to the man who'd thought her silence meant weakness, to the crash of a glass table breaking under his weight, the judge's voice, cold and tired, detention or enlistment when you turn 18. She'd chosen the uniform, not because she wanted to serve, but because it gave her rules, structure, a battlefield where survival wasn't a crime. Back in the present, the general nodded to the referee. Begin. The Marines moved in formation, 2 front, 2 flank, coordinated, textbook. But combat wasn't a textbook. The first Marine lunged, reaching for a collar tie. She dropped under, pivoting left. Her knee struck his outer thigh, lateral femoral cutaneous nerve, and his leg went dead instantly. He dropped, confusion flashing across his face. The second Marine swung high. She trapped his arm, twisting into a standing kimura. A grunt of pain, a quick tap, he was done. The third came in heavy, a double-leg takedown attempt. She sprawled, hooking his neck, her knee driving up into his ribs. He gasped, air gone. She released, sweeping him flat. The fourth hesitated too long. She closed distance, swept his base, and locked his knee until he tapped. 15 seconds. The entire facility froze. 4 Marines lay on the mat, breathing hard, eyes wide. She moved instantly into care mode, kneeling beside the first man, checking his leg, her voice soft and clinical. "You're okay. Breathe." Her switch from predator to protector was seamless. That, more than the fight, silenced them. General Mitchell stepped forward. His voice carried the weight of quiet authority. "What you just witnessed," he said, "is why we never underestimate anyone. Sergeant First Class Hawthorne is a Special Operations Combatives instructor. She's trained elite units in real combat, not demonstrations." No one laughed now. Torres approached, still catching his breath, pride wounded but intact enough to speak truth. "Sergeant, what you did, that's not in our program. Would you teach us?" Her eyes softened just slightly. "If you're willing to learn." That moment wasn't victory, it was recognition. The kind she'd been chasing her whole life. Because it wasn't about beating Marines. It was about something quieter, proving that silence doesn't mean weakness, and respect isn't owed, it's earned. That night, long after the lights of the facility went dark, she sat alone on the barracks step. The air smelled of salt and diesel. Her hands were still wrapped in the faint scent of sweat and rubber. She stared at them, the same hands that had once held onto a broken childhood, a rifle, a fallen friend, and now the small tremor of fatigue. She flexed her fingers slowly. In the distance, the Pacific whispered against the shore. She wasn't proud of what she did, not exactly. Pride was too simple. What she felt was peace, the kind that comes when a part of you that's been doubted finally gets to breathe. In the reflection of the barracks window, she saw herself, smaller than the legends she'd been compared to, older than she'd felt, stronger than she'd ever wanted to be. She thought about the 4 Marines, how they looked at her before the fight and after. Maybe that was the real win, not the takedowns, not the applause, but the shift in their eyes, the quiet respect that doesn't need to be spoken. Somewhere inside, the little girl from Detroit, the one who'd learned to fight just to exist, smiled. She'd never wanted to be noticed. But sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. What did silence sound like after the storm? For Ben Hawthorne, it was the hum of the bass generator, the rhythm of boots on pavement, the quiet between ocean gusts. But inside her head there was still movement, echoes of the mat, the thud of bodies, the disbelief frozen in every face. She didn't sleep much that night. Soldiers rarely did after combat, even the kind that didn't spill blood. 15 seconds on a mat had reopened years of buried memory, years that didn't stay where she'd left them. At 4:30 she was already awake, lacing her running shoes with the precision of ritual. She always tied the left tighter than the right, a superstition from ranger school. It kept her grounded, she used to say. The horizon was just beginning to bruise with dawn when she started her run across the base perimeter. The Pacific wind cut sharp against her face, filling her lungs with salt and cold. Every stride, every breath, was a meditation. Somewhere behind her, she could still hear the laughter that had greeted her the day before, the same laughter she'd lived with for half her life. They never laughed after, she thought, but the echoes always came before. As the sun cracked the edge of the ocean, her mind drifted to another dawn, not California, but Syria. Different sand, different smell. The kind of dawn that came after a night of explosions so close you could taste the metal in the air. She'd been 27 then. Sergeant First Class Ben Hawthorne, 75th Ranger Regiment, Raqqa Operation. A narrow street lined with collapsed buildings, stray dogs, the faint hiss of burning wire. Her team was clearing structures when the ambush came. A doorway, a shadow, then the world exploded. She still remembered the concussion, not sound but pressure. Then silence. Her fire team leader, Collins, had gone down first. She pulled him behind cover, hands shaking but steady enough to find the tourniquet. "Stay with me," she'd whispered, but he was already fatting, eyes glazed in disbelief more than pain. When her M4 clicked empty, she'd felt something shift inside her, not rage, not fear, a kind of cold acceptance. Training dissolved, instinct remained. The man who rushed her with a rifle but never saw her move. She dropped low, felt the impact skim her shoulder and drove upward, elbow to throat. Another came from the side, knife drawn, but she'd already turned, hooking his wrist, snapping bone, using his weight to drive him into the wall. She didn't remember the details, only the aftermath, dust settling, the smell of iron and cordite, her own breath echoing in her ears. When QRF arrived 20 minutes later, she was still standing, eyes blank, blood not hers. They called it valor. She called it survival. The Silver Star citation said, for gallantry under fire. But what the paperwork didn't say was how her hands wouldn't stop shaking for weeks after. How every creak in the barracks made her flinch. How she'd scrubbed her knuckles raw, trying to remove the ghosts that blood leaves behind. She told no one. Because in the military, silence was safer than sympathy. You learn to function, not to feel. Back on the base trail, the rhythm of her boots pulled her back to the present. She slowed to a jog, then to a walk, breathing through the ghosts until her pulse steadied. When she returned to the barracks, the morning routine had begun. Reveille, mess hall chatter, the scent of powdered eggs and burnt coffee. Conversation stopped when she entered. Not hostility this time, something else, respect, curiosity. She didn't know which was heavier. "Morning, Sergeant," a Marine corporal said softly as she passed. He didn't meet her eyes, none of them did. She didn't need them to. Respect rarely came in words. At 900, she stood outside the training facility again. Torres was waiting by the mat, clipboard in hand, a bruise darkening his forearm. He looked different, smaller somehow, not in size but in ego. "Morning, Sergeant Hawthorne," he said. The tone was professional now, stripped of humor. "We set up an instructor exchange per the general's request. You run today's session." She nodded once. "All right, grab your 4, same ones from yesterday." The Marines hesitated, but Torres gave a single nod. They stepped forward, not defiant now, but focused. Hawthorne pulled a whiteboard closer, drew a single line across it. "This," she said, "is the difference between demonstration and survival." She tapped the left side. "Here, you perform moves for approval." Then the right. "Here, you do what it takes to live. The trick is knowing when to cross that line and how to come back." Her voice was calm, deliberate, the tone of someone who'd already seen the cost of crossing that line too many times. They listened. For the first time, they really listened. Over the next hour, she broke down every movement, leverage, control, timing. Her approach wasn't about domination but efficiency. She explained how fear wasn't an obstacle but a compass, how your body could lie but your training couldn't, how every fight began long before the first punch. "Violence," she said, pausing, "isn't strength. It's communication, brutal, fast, and final. The one who listens better usually walks away." Torres watched her demonstrate on him. She moved with precision, never showy, always exact. Each grip, each strike ended just before pain, controlled, restrained. There was beauty in that restraint, the kind that comes only from years of surviving chaos. By the end, the room felt different. The laughter from yesterday had evaporated, replaced by the stillness of understanding. When she finished, she didn't bow or salute. She simply stepped off the mat, picked up her water bottle, and walked out. Outside, the sunlight hit her face, warm, honest. For the first time in months, she felt something that wasn't tension. But peace in her world never lasted long. That afternoon, a message came through from Fort Liberty. Temporary assignment concluded. Report to Special Warfare Center. She'd been recalled. She stared at the message on the screen, the black text flickering under fluorescent light. Part of her had expected it. Special operations never truly let you go. But another part, the one that had started to enjoy the normalcy of morning runs and quiet meals, felt the familiar ache of being uprooted again. Torres found her an hour later by the bleachers, her duffel already packed. "You leaving?" he asked. She nodded. "They said you're going back to train, what was it? Smaller frame tactics." "Something like that." He scratched the back of his neck. "You know, my guys haven't stopped talking about you, not about the fight, about how you moved, the calm, like you'd already seen it all." She met his eyes, not unkindly. "I have." He hesitated, then extended his hand. "For what it's worth, Sergeant, you changed how they see things here." She took his hand, firm grip, brief nod. "Then it was worth it." As she walked toward the transport lot, duffel slung over her shoulder, the general's voice echoed faintly from earlier that day. "Never underestimate the quiet ones." She smiled faintly at that. It wasn't about being quiet. It was about knowing when to speak, and when to let actions echo louder than words. The plane back to Fort Liberty was packed with soldiers, contractors, noise, but to her, it was all distant. She stared out the small window, watching the world shrink below her. Clouds blurred into one another, white and endless. In her reflection, she saw two versions of herself overlapping, the soldier and the girl from Detroit. The girl who'd been told she wouldn't last a week. The soldier who'd lasted 13 years. She thought about every person who'd looked past her, every officer who'd mistaken her silence for submission, every rival who'd underestimated her. It used to anger her. Now it just reminded her how invisible strength could be. Her mind wandered again, not to war but to childhood. Detroit winters, cracked sidewalks, plastic-covered windows that never kept the cold out. She'd been 12 when she'd learned what fear really was. Not violence, fear. The kind that comes when footsteps approach your door at night and you don't know if they'll bring trouble or food. That's where she'd learned stillness. That's where she'd first understood leverage, not physical but emotional. People underestimated you when you were quiet. They told you things, showed you things. And if you listened long enough, you could survive almost anything. That same quiet had carried her through basic, through ranger school, through Syria, through every moment when men twice her size thought strength was measured in pounds. It was. It was measured in resolve, in the ability to stand still when everything screamed run. She leaned back against the seat, eyes closing. The hum of the engines lulled her toward half-sleep. In that drifting space between consciousness and dream, she saw flashes, the mat, the laughter, Raka, Colin's face, the table shattering in Detroit. All of it woven together, a single thread, survival. When the plane touched down hours later, she opened her eyes. The world outside was gray and wet, Fort Liberty's usual mood. She gathered her bag, stood, and walked down the ramp into the drizzle. No applause, no cameras, just the quiet crunch of gravel under boots. As she reached the gate, she looked up at the sign, U.S. Army John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center. The place where warriors were made, and sometimes unmade. She took a deep breath. Back to the beginning, she thought. Or maybe, back to the part of herself she still hadn't learned to forgive. Because behind every fight she'd ever won was one she still hadn't faced, the one inside. The one that began long before the uniform. And that fight was coming. She'd forgotten how heavy Fort Liberty felt. Not the air was the same as any base, diesel and damp, but the weight of memory that clung to the walls. Every corridor carried echoes, boots hitting tile, the bark of orders, laughter from classes she used to teach. But what haunted her most wasn't the sound, it was the absence of it. People nodded when she passed, the polite acknowledgement reserved for someone whose name carried quiet legend. Morning, Sergeant Hawthorne. Ma'am. Always formal, always respectful but distant. Respect and isolation often walk side by side. She learned that early. Inside the combatives' facility, the mats were new, but the walls still bore faint indentations from years of impact. She ran her hand across one of them, the ghost of an old lesson, maybe one she'd delivered. This was where she'd once trained rangers, green berets, night stalkers, men and women who'd go on to places no one could talk about. Now she was here again, not to fight, but to build something new. Advanced SOCP tactics, adaptive combat for smaller operators. That was the official title of the new program. Unofficially, they were calling it the Hawthorne course. It wasn't about glory. It was about survival, teaching others to weaponize disadvantage. To move faster, smarter, quieter. To think like the underdog, even when you weren't one. That morning she stood before a class of 20 mixed ranks, mixed services. Army, Marines, a few Air Force Spec Ops. They'd all read her file. They all knew the story from Camp Pendleton, the viral whisper spreading through bases. The small Army woman who dropped 4 Marines in 15 seconds. It wasn't official doctrine, but in the barracks it was legend. She didn't like legends. Legends distorted truth. Before we start, she said, voice steady, I need you to forget what you've heard. Silence, every pair of eyes locked on her. What I did at Pendleton, that wasn't magic. That was training, and pain, and repetition until your body remembers what your mind wants to forget. Her tone wasn't motivational, it was surgical. Each word landed with purpose. I'm not here to make you dangerous, she continued. You already are. I'm here to make you deliberate, because the moment you act without control, you've already lost. She scanned the room, gauging who was listening, who was. Half of them looked curious, a few skeptical, 1 or 2 afraid. Good, she thought, fear was honest, fear was teachable. The session began. She paired them off, demonstrated angles, leverage, nerve points, every move precise, minimal, efficient. When one Marine, a sergeant named O'Neill, tried to overpower her during a demonstration, she redirected his energy, flipped his balance, and pinned him before he even realized what happened. Her knee pressed gently against his diaphragm. "Breathe through it," she said. He gasped. "That's the point," she continued. "Control. You don't fight the opponent, you fight their intent." The room was silent again. It wasn't the silence of all this time. It was comprehension. Hours passed, sweat darkened the mats, muscles trembled. When the session ended, they were exhausted. She was. She simply stood there, calm, hands clasped behind her back, watching them file out. One of the instructors, Master Sergeant Ray Collins, same last name as her fallen teammate, though unrelated, lingered behind. He'd served under her once in Syria. "Never thought I'd see you back here," he said. "Neither did I," she replied. He studied her quietly. "You look different." She smirked faintly. "Older." "No," he said, "lighter, like you finally put something down." She hesitated. "Or maybe I just stopped carrying things that weren't mine." That was her way of saying she'd finally learned what guilt she could live with, and which kind never went away. Later that evening, she walked alone across the training field. The grass was wet with evening dew, reflecting the last light of sunset. The bass loudspeakers played taps in the distance, that haunting, wordless song that meant another day gone. She sat on the edge of the bleachers, staring at the horizon. The sound of taps always did something to her, pulled her back into spaces between silence and sorrow. It wasn't about loss anymore. It was about what stayed after loss, the echoes that didn't leave. For years, she'd thought survival was the goal. But the truth she'd learned, and never said aloud, was this. Survival was just the beginning of the next battle, the one inside. She took out a folded letter from her pocket, the one she'd kept for years, yellowed and worn. It was from her first Ranger instructor, written after she'd graduated. The handwriting was blocky, confident. "Hawthorne, you'll spend your life proving what you already know. The day you stop trying to prove it is the day you'll finally be free." She traced the ink with her thumb. The words had haunted her once. Now they comforted her. The next day, she began filming footage for the training modules, demonstration videos, tactical breakdowns. The production team followed her every move. She didn't like cameras. Cameras caught faces. Faces caught feelings. But she understood the purpose. Soldiers in remote deployments needed to learn these techniques. As the camera rolled, she moved through drills, takedown counters, weapon retention, close quarters control. Her motions were fluid, detached, almost meditative. Between takes, the director asked her, "Sergeant, could you look at the camera when you explain that?" She did once, and in that brief glance something raw surfaced. "People think combat is chaos," she said, eyes unblinking. "It's not, it's math, it's rhythm. You count distance, timing, intent. The only chaos is inside you, and if you can quiet that, you win." The crew fell silent. Even the sound guy stopped breathing for a second. She broke eye contact, exhaled slowly. "Let's reset." That night she was in her quarters, sitting at her desk, the hum of the fluorescent light above her steady and soft. Her reflection in the dark window looked older than she felt. The metal case sat open, silver star, Ranger tab, airborne wings. Symbols of stories no one really knew. She reached out, touched the silver star lightly. The metal was cold. Every metal was a ghost, a reminder that someone else hadn't made it home. The knock on her door came quietly. She turned, enter. It was Ray Collins again, holding a folder. "Ma'am, Command wants a debrief tomorrow. They're considering sending a few of us to observe your advanced module." She nodded, "Good." He hesitated, "There's something else." He handed her a printout, a mission photo from Syria, her old unit. A handwritten note at the bottom, "You should come see us sometime. We still talk about Raqqa." She stared at it for a long moment. "Who sent this?" "Staff Sergeant Vega," he said. "He's with 3rd Battalion now." She nodded slowly, eyes distant. "Tell him I said thanks." When he left, she sat there, staring at the photo, 6 faces, dirt-streaked, tired, alive. 5 of them still breathing. 1 not. Collins, her fire team leader. The man who taught her that courage wasn't loud. It was the quiet act of standing when you have every reason to stay down. She remembered the way he'd smiled at her before that last mission. Don't get lost in your own head, Hawthorne. The world's already heavy enough. Now, years later, she realized she'd never really left that collapsed building. She just learned to function inside the rubble. The following week, she introduced a new drill to her students: sensory reduction. Lights off, noise simulated, only instinct. She explained it simply. If you can think, you can panic, so learn to move before thought. They practiced for hours, fumbling in the dark, guided only by voice and touch. When the lights came back on, they were drenched in sweat and silence. She walked among them, voice calm but carrying. "This is what it's like when everything goes wrong," she said. "You either freeze or you find yourself." She paused, scanning their faces. And the hardest part of all, once you find that version of yourself, you can't unmeet them. That's the part you live with. After class, one of the younger soldiers approached her, a female corporal, barely 20. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "how do you turn it off after?" Hawthorne looked at her, really looked, saw herself a decade younger, still learning to pretend she wasn't afraid. "You don't," she said. "You just learn to live with the noise until it becomes music." The corporal nodded slowly, unsure if it was comfort or warning. Later that night, as she walked the quiet halls of Fort Liberty, she stopped at the memorial wall, names etched in black glass, lit from below. Her reflection blended with the letters. She reached out, fingers grazing a familiar name: Collins, R.J. Her throat tightened. For years, she'd avoided saying his name out loud. Saying it made it real. A voice behind her, soft, uncertain. "Sergeant Hawthorne." She turned. It was one of her students, O'Neill, the Marine she'd floored during training. He looked uneasy. "I just wanted to say thanks for yesterday, for not embarrassing me in front of everyone." She smiled faintly. "You did that yourself." He laughed once nervously. "Fair, but seriously, you made me realize something. I've been fighting like I'm invincible. You showed me what control really looks like." She nodded. "Good, that's the point." He hesitated, then asked, "How do you do it? Stay that calm?" She looked back at the wall. "I remember who can't," she said quietly, "and I owe them my stillness." The hallway light flickered once, then steadied. Her reflection in the glass seemed almost like another person, someone older, wiser, maybe even peaceful. But inside, the same question lingered, the one that had followed her from Detroit to Raqqa to Pendleton. What does peace look like for someone built for war? No one had ever given her an answer. Maybe that was because peace wasn't a place. It was a choice, one she had to make every day, even when it didn't feel possible. She turned from the wall and walked away, her footsteps soft but certain. Behind her, the names remained, silent witnesses to the only truth she still believed in. Sometimes strength isn't in fighting harder. It's in finally learning when to stop. What happens when control breaks? For weeks, Sergeant First Class Ben Hawthorne had lived in the rhythm of training, dawn runs, drills, repetition, until her body moved without thought. It was a pattern she trusted. Patterns meant safety. Patterns meant she didn't have to feel. But war has a way of finding the quiet ones, even in places built for peace. It started on an ordinary Tuesday. The morning smelled of gun, oil, and coffee. The echo of boots on the mat floor blended with barked cadence, a sound she could have set her watch to. Her students were midway through a grappling rotation when the door at the far end of the facility slammed open. A young instructor burst in, face pale. "Ma'am, range accident, building 42. They need medical assistance now." She didn't ask questions, Training mode switched on like muscle memory. "Grab the med kit," she barked, already running. The range was 2 blocks away. By the time she arrived, the scene was chaos, a live fire drill gone wrong. One trainee down, chest wound, blood spreading fast. Another frozen beside him, shaking, weapon still slung. Hawthorne dropped to her knees. "Pressure here," she ordered, guiding the nearest corporal's hands. The soldier hesitated. She met his eyes. "Now." He pressed down. She tore open a trauma kit, worked with mechanical calm. Her gloves slicked red. "Pulse weak," someone said. "Keep pressure." Her voice didn't waver. "He's still here." She looked up, saw the shooter, a young private, crumbling against the wall. The same private she drilled on safety protocols 2 days ago. His lips trembled. I didn't mean to." The round ricocheted. She met his eyes, saw panic, guilt, a lifetime of it forming in seconds. "Not now," she said quietly. "Breathe, we'll deal with it after." Medics arrived moments later, taking over compressions. As they loaded the injured trainee onto the stretcher, she stepped back, stripped off her gloves, blood streaking her forearms. Her hands didn't shake, not yet. The base commander's report called it a training mishap. To her, it felt like history repeating itself. The randomness, the noise, the helpless pause between life and death. That night she sat alone outside the barracks, the glow from the range lights painting her face in pale gold. She rubbed her hands together, still feeling phantom warmth. Control was supposed to be her anchor, but what do you do when control starts to feel like numbness? The following morning her class was quiet. No jokes, no chatter. They all knew. Word spread fast on bases. She stood before them, expression unreadable. "You'll hear rumors," she said. "Ignore them. We train so that when the worst happens, we don't freeze. Yesterday proves why that matters." Her tone was harder than usual, clipped edges, no softness. Then she hesitated, just long enough for truth to leak through. "Sometimes, even when you do everything right, it still goes wrong. You live with that, and you keep moving." Her eyes lingered on the private who'd fired the shot. They'd kept him in the program under investigation. He avoided her gaze, guilt heavy as armor. She knew that weight too well. The drill began. Grapple, release, strike, reset. Over and over until sweat blurred vision and breath turned ragged. She pushed them harder than ever, as if punishing the air itself for daring to take someone again. By the end, her uniform was soaked through, her voice hoarse. When everyone had gone, she stayed behind, packing the edge of the mat. Her reflection in the mirror looked calm, but she could feel the tremor just under the skin. For the first time in years, she wanted to hit something without purpose. She didn't. Instead, she sat down on the mat, knees drawn in, breath shaky. In her head, the sounds merged: the gunshot, Colin's voice, the laughter from Pendleton, the glass table shattering in Detroit. Different years, same echo. 2 days later, the base chaplain found her sitting on the bleachers after lights out. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, easing down beside her. "Never been good at it," she said. He studied her quietly. "You were on scene at the range. How's your soldier?" "Still in surgery," she replied. "And you?" She almost laughed. "Still functional." He smiled gently. "That's not the same thing." "No," she admitted, "it's not." For a while they just listened to the night insects, to the hum of the floodlights, to everything and nothing. Finally he said, "You know, sometimes the strongest people aren't the ones who stand tall. They're the ones who kneel when they don't have to." She looked at him. "You sound like a motivational poster, chaplain." "Maybe," he said, "but even posters have truth." When he left, she stayed, staring at the empty field. She whispered something she hadn't said in years. "Stay with me." The same words she'd said to Collins in Raqqa. The same plea she hadn't realized she was still carrying. Days passed. The wounded soldier stabilized. The investigation cleared the private of negligence. Training resumed. Life moved on, as it always did. But something inside her hadn't. She found herself distracted during drills, eyes flicking toward every sound. Her calm, once unshakable, now felt brittle. During one exercise, O'Neill, her Marine student, misread a signal and came in too hard. His elbow clipped her temple. A spark of pain flashed white, followed by instinct. She moved before thinking, takedown, pressure, submission. He tapped instantly. She held a second too long. When she released him, the room was silent. He sat up coughing. "Ma'am, I didn't mean." "I know," she said, voice low, steady, too steady. "Take 5. She turned away before they could see the tremor in her hand. That evening, she visited the base gym alone. No lights, just moon through high windows. She shadowboxed in silence, fists striking air, rhythm like heartbeat. Each movement a question she couldn't answer. Why couldn't she turn it off? Why did every mistake sound like a gunshot in her head? Her reflection blurred in the window, each punch ghosting through versions of herself, the girl, the soldier, the instructor. All of them fighting the same invisible thing. Eventually she stopped. Her breath echoed through the empty space. And for the first time she let herself feel it, not anger, not fear, just grief. Grief for the one she couldn't save. Grief for the version of herself who thought survival was enough. She sat down on the floor, back against the wall, eyes closing. Tears didn't fall, she'd forgotten how to cry. But the weight in her chest finally shifted, just enough to breathe. The next morning, she gathered her class outside under open sky. No mats, no walls, just earth. "Today," she said, "we do something different." They waited. "We talk." Murmurs of confusion, she ignored them. "I want each of you to tell me about the moment you learned you were afraid," she said. "Not in combat, before that. The first time." One by one they spoke. A car crash, a storm, a father's anger. When it came to the private, the one from the range, his voice shook. "When I saw the blood, I couldn't move. I kept hearing the shot, I still hear it." Hawthorne nodded. "You will, it doesn't go away, but you learn to live with it, because that's sound. That's the price of being alive when others are." They all watched her then, waiting for her own answer. She hesitated, then said quietly, "Mine was at 14, in a kitchen. Someone I trusted tried to hurt me. I fought back. I didn't know I could. I learned that night that fear isn't the enemy, it's the teacher." Silence followed, heavy, respectful. For the first time, they saw not just the instructor, but the woman underneath. "Training isn't just about fighting," she finished. "It's about who you become when fighting ends." That afternoon, she stood alone at the range again. The blood had long been clean, but she could still see it, a faint echo, a ghost stain only she noticed. She closed her eyes, whispered the words she'd taught her class. "Fear is a teacher." And for the first time, she believed them. Behind her, footsteps approached. It was Ray Collins. "Command wants you to lead a cross-branch seminar next month," he said. She smiled faintly. "Guess the legend keeps spreading." "Maybe it's time it did." He paused, then added, "You know, for someone who doesn't like attention, you're building quite a following." She shrugged. "I'm not building anything. I'm just trying to teach people not to repeat my mistakes." "What mistake is that?" She looked back toward the range. Thinking control meant healing. He didn't have a response for that. He just nodded quietly. That night she walked the perimeter alone. Wind moved through the trees, soft and low. Somewhere a coyote cried. She stopped under a floodlight and looked at her shadow stretching long across the ground. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting. Maybe it was about learning to stand inside the memory and still breathe. She tilted her head back, eyes tracing the constellations she'd memorized on deployments. Same stars, different wars. "Collins," she whispered, half to the sky, "you were right, the world's heavy, but I'm still standing." She smiled small, real. And for the first time since Raqqa, she felt something almost like peace. Not because she'd outrun the ghosts, but because she'd finally stopped running. What happens when a story becomes bigger than the person who lived it? For Sergeant First Class bin Hawthorne, legends had always been someone else's problem. But when the orders came down, Joint Services Combative Symposium, Camp Pendleton keynote instructor, SFCB Hawthorne, she felt the ground tilt beneath her. Back to the same place. Back to the laughter, the mat, the 15 seconds that had followed her name across every base in the country. She packed light, always had. 2 uniforms, 1 duffel, 1 set of running shoes. Everything else she carried was invisible. The flight to California was quiet. She sat by the window again, watching the clouds fold and unfold like memory. A young Marine across the aisle recognized her patch, whispered to a friend, "That's her." She pretended not to hear. Fame in uniform was a strange thing, earned in moments, paid for with years. When the plane landed, the ocean smell hit first, salt and jet fuel. Camp Pendleton looked the same. Sprawling ranges, sun-bleached barracks, flags snapping in the coastal wind. Different faces, same rhythm. A sergeant major met her on the tarmac, stiff and formal. "Ma'am, the commandant asked me to escort you. We've got the instructors assembled in Hangar B." She nodded, "Let's get to it." Inside, the hangar buzzed with conversation. Dozens of instructors from every branch, Army, Marines, Air Force, Navy, SOF, stood around the mats, arms crossed, skeptical curiosity in their eyes. And there near the back she saw them. Torres, Ramirez, Colt, Hinds, Park, the same 4 Marines from that day. They looked older, she did too. When she stepped onto the mat, the noise died. No laughter this time, only the soft scuff of boots. "Good morning," she began, voice steady. "Some of you know who I am. Most of you have heard stories. Stories tend to grow legs the more they walk, so let's start with the truth." She let that hang for a beat. "I didn't beat 4 Marines. I demonstrated that predictability gets you hurt, that's it. The rest is myth." Torres gave a small nod from the back, confirming it for those who doubted. She paced slowly, bare feet whispering against the mat. "Today isn't about ego. It's about humility, the kind that keeps people alive. Every one of you here trains killers. My job is to make sure you're teaching survivors." The session began with simple drills. Movement, breathing, redirection. She moved among them like water, adjusting elbows, correcting balance. Her calm was contagious. Even the cocky ones listened. Halfway through, she called Torres forward. "Staff Sergeant," she said, "you and I owe the room a demonstration." A ripple of anticipation. They faced each other, bowed slightly out of habit. The mat smelled of rubber and adrenaline. Torres grinned. "You planning to drop me again, ma'am?" She smirked. "Let's find out." They moved slow at first, controlled. Grip, release, footwork, 2 professionals reading each other like a familiar book. When he lunged, she pivoted, using the same leverage as before, but stopped short, just an inch from the nerve strike. Her voice broke the silence. "See that? Old me would have finished the move. New me chooses when not to." She released him gently, and the room exhaled. Lesson learned. Torres rubbed his arm, smiling. "You've got even better." She shook her head. "No, just quieter." Applause wasn't allowed in uniform training, but the sound that followed was close enough, a collective breath of respect. Later, during a break, Torres joined her by the bleachers. "Funny, huh? You turn one bad assumption into doctrine." She took a sip from her canteen. "I didn't turn it into anything. People needed a story. I just happened to be in it." He laughed softly. "Still hate the attention." "Always." "Then why come back?" She looked toward the horizon. The Pacific glittered under the midday sun. "Because if people are going to tell the story, I'd rather they learn the right lesson. That evening, the symposium hosted a round-table discussion. Senior officers, instructors, psychologists, all talking about integrating combatives training across branches. Hawthorne sat at the end of the table, quiet until someone asked, "Sergeant, from a human factors perspective, what separates a fighter who survives from one who freezes?" She thought for a long moment before answering. "Awareness," she said finally, "not of the enemy of yourself. Fear isn't weakness, it's information. The ones who freeze aren't cowards, they're overloaded. You want to build resilience. Teach them to listen to fear without obeying it." A colonel across from her frowned. "So you're saying fear is useful?" She met his eyes. "Every instinct you have is trying to keep you alive. Ignoring it is arrogance. Understanding it, that's discipline." The room was silent. Then the colonel nodded slowly. "Noted, Sergeant." Afterward, a few younger officers approached her, asking for copies of her notes. She didn't have any. Everything she said lived in muscle memory, not paper. Later that night, she walked alone along the flight line. The hangars loomed like sleeping giants, and the air smelled of sea and steel. From somewhere nearby came laughter, young Marines telling stories they'd half forget by morning. She caught a few words. "That's the one who dropped 4 of us." She smiled, shaking her head. Legends never die easy. She stopped near the same combatives facility from years ago, lights off now. Through the glass, she could still see the faint outline of the mat, the ghosts of who they'd been. She whispered to the empty space, "Guess we did all right, huh?" The wind answered, soft and warm. The next day was live simulation training, mixed branch teams running scenarios through mock urban structures. Hawthorne supervised from the observation deck, headset on, eyes scanning every movement. Team 3, led by Tors, moved through a narrow hallway when the lights cut unexpectedly. Power failure. The comms crackled, then died. Hawthorne's heart tightened. It was an almost perfect replay of Raqqa, the darkness, the sudden silence. She forced her breath steady. "Stay calm," she whispered, even though no one could hear her. Minutes crawled. The emergency lights flickered on, painting the corridor red. One trainee was missing. She didn't wait for protocol. She sprinted down the stairs, sidearm holstered, instincts already mapping exits. Her boots hit concrete hard as she entered the structure, echoes of movement ahead. "Private Singh," she called. No answer. She found him crouched in a side room, shaking, breathing too fast. Flashback overload. She knelt beside him, voice low, steady. "Hey, you're okay, look at me." He tried to speak, couldn't. His hands were trembling. "Breathe with me," she said, matching his rhythm. "In, out, good." Slowly the panic faded from his eyes. "I thought I failed." She shook her head. "You didn't fail, you froze. Everyone freezes. The point is what you do next." He nodded, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on his face. When they emerged from the structure, the team turned, startled to see her guiding him out. She gave a single nod to Tors. "He's fine." Afterward, the command staff debriefed her. She downplayed it, of course, but word spread fast, not about the rescue, about how she'd stayed calm when everyone else stalled. Tors found her later. "You know, you didn't have to go in yourself." "Maybe not," she said, "but I wasn't going to watch another kid drown in silence." He studied her, still carrying Raqqa. "Every day," she admitted, "but it carries lighter when you use it for something good." That night the symposium ended with a closing ceremony. Officers gave speeches, certificates changed hands. When the commandant took the stage, his final words surprised her. "Courage," he said, "isn't measured by volume or muscle. It's measured by presence." Sergeant First Class Hawthorne reminded us of that. She turned a story into a standard. Applause followed, not loud but long. She stood there, expression unreadable, accepting the handshake that came with the commendation. Awards never sat comfortably on her shoulders, but the respect behind them, that mattered. After the crowd dispersed, she lingered by the empty podium. Torres approached one last time. "So what now?" he asked. "Back to Fort Liberty," she said. "New students, same lessons. You ever think about writing it down, everything you've seen?" She smiled faintly. "I'm better at fighting ghosts than chasing publishers." He chuckled, "Fair enough." Then more seriously, "You changed this place, whether you wanted to or not." She looked around, the same hangar, the same mat, but a different silence now. Respectful, earned. "Maybe it changed itself," she said. They shook hands, firm grip, mutual understanding. As he turned to leave, he called back. "You know, Sergeant, sometimes legends do more good than truth." She answered without looking. "Maybe, but truth sleeps better at night." Later, at the edge of the base, she stood watching the Pacific again. The wind tugged at her hair, waves rolled steady, eternal. In the distance, helicopters traced lines across the sky, tiny silhouettes against the fading orange light. She thought about the journey that had brought her back here. Detroit, Raqqa, Pendleton, Liberty, and now again to the water's edge. All that time, all those battles, and still one lesson remained. Strength wasn't a roar. It was a whisper that refused to die. She closed her eyes, breathing in salt and silence. The ghosts were quieter tonight. Not gone, never gone, but finally at peace with their place beside her. When she opened her eyes, she whispered the words that had carried her through every storm, every bruise, every fight. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Then she turned from the ocean, shoulders squared, and walked back toward the lights of the base. Ready for whatever came next. What do you leave behind when the battle, over? For Sergeant First Class Ben Hawthorne, the flight back to Fort Liberty felt different this time. Not heavy, not haunted. Just quiet. The ocean had stayed in her mind, that endless horizon, the sound of waves against steel. It reminded her that movement didn't always mean progress, and stillness didn't always mean peace. Sometimes both were the same thing. When the plane touched down, she exhaled slowly. Back to red clay, pine trees, and the faint metallic smell of the armory. Home, if soldiers ever had such a thing. 2 weeks later, she stood at the edge of a new training field, clipboard in hand, scanning the fresh group of recruits assigned to her advanced combatives course. 22 faces, 22 stories, most of them too young to know what loss really meant. Her eyes caught on one girl standing apart from the rest, small frame, cropped hair, eyes sharp and cautious. Maybe 19, maybe 20. There was something in her stance, weight balanced, ready to move. Familiar. When the introductions began, the girl spoke clearly. "Corporal Lena Briggs, ma'am, airborne qualified, volunteered for this course." Hawthorne nodded once. "Any prior combatives experience?" "Yes, ma'am. Civilian jiu-jitsu before enlistment." "Good, that'll help in hurt." A few chuckles rippled through the group. Briggs smiled faintly, then straightened. Hawthorne moved on. But inside, she'd already marked it. The resemblance wasn't just physical. It was the way the girl's silence had weight. The same kind of silence Hawthorne had worn for years. The first week was pure grind. Drills, strikes, pressure, repetition until muscles screamed. The heat was relentless, the mats slick with sweat and effort. Every day ended with bruises, but no one quit. That was the rule. You could hurt but not stop. Hawthorne pushed them, but differently than before. She wasn't teaching them to win. She was teaching them to endure, to think through the noise. "Every fight ends the same way," she said one morning, packing before the class. "Someone stops first, physically, mentally, or morally. The trick is not to make it you." Briggs listened harder than the rest. Her movements were sharp, efficient, but there was something else beneath them, tension. Not fear, suppression. Hawthorne recognized it immediately. The kind of focus that hides pain. During a sparring rotation, Briggs went against a larger male trainee. He underestimated her like they always did. She slipped his grab, redirected, took him down clean, controlled. But when he tried to scramble up, she didn't stop. The choke came fast, too fast. Her eyes were distant, far away. "Corporal," Hawthorne's voice cracked through the room like a gunshot. Briggs froze, realization dawning too late. The man tapped out, coughing. Hawthorne stepped in, calm but firm. That wasn't control, that was emotion. Briggs avoided her gaze. "Yes, ma'am." "Do you know the difference?" "Yes, ma'am." "Do you?" The silence said enough. After class, Hawthorne found her outside, sitting alone on the bleachers, hands shaking just enough to betray her calm. "You want to tell me what that was about?" Hawthorne asked quietly. Briggs stared at the ground. "He grabbed my collar, just reflex." "Reflexes come from repetition," Hawthorne said. "So what's the repetition from?" A pause, then softly. "Foster care, before the army, got used to fighting back." Hawthorne blinked once. The answer landed like a ghost. The same story, told in a different voice. She sat beside her. "And you figured if you kept fighting, no one could ever corner you again." Briggs' eyes flicked up, wary. "You don't know that." "I do," Hawthorne said quietly, "because I used to be you." The girl's shoulders tensed, then slowly they eased. Neither spoke for a long while. The wind carried the faint metallic clang of the training yard in the distance. Finally, Hawthorne said, "You can't live like every hand's a threat. You'll wear out before the enemy even finds you." Briggs nodded, but her eyes were still far away. "I know, ma'am," she whispered, "but sometimes I don't know where the fight ends." Hawthorne exhaled softly. "That's the question that never goes away." Over the following weeks, their dynamic shifted. Briggs stopped flinching when corrected, stopped hiding her fear behind aggression. Hawthorne saw her start to breathe again, not just survive. She reminded herself to stay detached. Instructors weren't supposed to care, but she did, maybe too much. It wasn't about mentorship anymore. It was about redemption, passing forward what she'd once needed and never got. During an end-of-week drill, Briggs slipped during a takedown and caught her shoulder wrong. Pain flashed across her face, but she refused to stop. "Out," Hawthorne ordered. "Ma'am, I'm fine." That wasn't a request. After dismissing the class, Hawthorne sat with her at the medic station while they wrapped the shoulder. Briggs muttered, "I didn't want to look weak." Hawthorne smiled faintly. "Weak is not knowing when to stop. Strength is knowing when you've done enough." Briggs looked up, hesitant. "You ever figure that out for yourself?" Hawthorne paused. "I'm still learning." One evening, after everyone left, Hawthorne lingered in the gym, cleaning the mats, something no one expected the senior instructor to do. The repetition was grounding, the smell of disinfectant oddly comforting. She didn't notice the general enter until his voice broke the quiet. "Sergeant Hawthorne." It was General Mitchell again, the same one from Pendleton. Older now, but still carrying that calm authority that could silence a room. She stood immediately. "Sir." "At ease," he said, stepping onto the mat. "I was nearby for evaluations. Thought I'd see how the famous Hawthorne course was doing." She smiled faintly. "Still bruising egos, sir." He laughed quietly. "I've read the reports. Impressive work. The Corps is integrating some of your principles into our programs." "Didn't think the Marines liked taking Army notes," she said. He grinned. "They do when they work." He studied her for a moment, expression softening. "You ever stop to realize what you've built here, Sergeant?" She shook her head. "I'm not building anything, sir, just teaching." "That's where you're wrong," he said. "Teaching is building. You're leaving something behind. Most of us spend a lifetime fighting wars that end. You're shaping a war that won't." She didn't respond right away. There were no medals for legacy, just echoes. Finally, she said, "Then I hope they build it better than we did." Mitchell nodded slowly. That's the best kind of legacy. Then with a small smile, he added, "You ever consider officer candidacy? We could use leaders like you." She chuckled softly. "I've spent my whole life trying not to become one of the people giving orders, sir." He laughed. "Fair enough. Keep doing what you're doing. You're making more difference than you realize." When he left, the silence returned, but it was lighter now. For the first time, she believed him. The next morning, she arrived early to find Briggs already there, stretching in the dim light. "You're here before sunrise," Hawthorne said. Briggs smiled. "Trying to be better, ma'am." "Trying good," Hawthorne said. "Just don't forget to breathe." They sparred briefly, teacher and student, movement flowing like mirrored rhythm. At one point, Briggs caught her sleeve, redirected perfectly. "Nice," Hawthorne said, grinning. "You're starting to listen." Briggs hesitated. "To you." "No," Hawthorne said softly, "to yourself." Weeks turned to months. The program's reputation grew. Other bases requested her methods, her training modules. They called it the Hawthorne Method now, a blend of SOCP principles, emotional control, and adaptive tactics for smaller fighters. She tried not to think about the name. It wasn't about her. It was about survival. But one night, as she walked past the training hall, she heard something that stopped her. Inside, the students were still drilling on their own time. She paused by the doorway, listening. Briggs was leading the group. "Remember," she said, her voice steady and calm, "violence isn't strength, it's communication. The one who listens better usually walks away." Hawthorne froze. Those were her exact words, the ones she'd spoken months ago during a demonstration. Hearing them echoed back hit her harder than she expected. It wasn't pride, it was something quieter, relief. Because for the first time in her life, she realized the story didn't have to end with her. It could keep moving through others, through every person who learned to stand without shouting, to fight without hatred, to carry peace into a place built for war. She smiled faintly, leaning against the doorframe. No one noticed her there, and she liked it that way. Later, walking back through the night air, she thought about everything that had brought her here: Detroit, Syria, Pendleton, Liberty. Every place had left its mark, but this one felt different. This one didn't hurt. She stopped by the memorial wall again, the names glowing under the soft lights. Her reflection merged with the letters, same as always. But tonight, she wasn't talking to ghosts. She was listening to them. "Maybe we did something right," she whispered. The wind carried the words away, soft and sure. The next morning, she handed Briggs her evaluation file. "Outstanding performance," she said. "You're cleared to assist with the next instructor course." Briggs' eyes widened. "Me, ma'am, I'm not." "You are," Hawthorne said. "You're ready, and you're going to make them better than me." Briggs swallowed hard. "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me, just teach it right." As Briggs walked away, Hawthorne watched her go, smaller figure, confident stride, steady breath. It was like watching a version of herself walk into the future she'd never had time to imagine. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what redemption looked like, not medals, not legends, just knowing you help someone else find their balance before the fall. That night, as she packed her duffel again for another rotation, she paused at the window. The training yard below glowed under floodlights, students moving like shadows on the mat. Her reflection stared back, calm, weathered, finally at peace with what she saw. The voice inside her that used to whisper, "You don't belong here," had grown quiet. Now it said something else. "You did what you came to do." She smiled, small, steady, true. And as the wind rustled through the pines outside, she whispered to the darkness, "Sometimes strength isn't loud. It's the sound of silence choosing to stay." How many times can you rebuild yourself before you stop recognizing what's left? Sergeant First Class Ben Hawthorne had finally found rhythm. Not peace, she wasn't naive enough to call it that, but rhythm. Morning runs through pine mist. Quiet coffee at dawn. The sound of students on the mat below, laughter not yet hardened by experience. It wasn't the life she'd imagined. It was better. Predictable human. But predictability, in her world, never lasted. The orders came on a Thursday. A thin envelope slipped under her door, official letterhead, familiar weight. She stared at it for a long time before opening it. Temporary deployment, 6-month advisory assignment, Joint Special Operations Detachment, Eastern Europe. The words blurred for a moment before her eyes steadied. 6 months, combat advisory. Not the front lines, not officially, but close enough. Close enough for ghosts to find her again. She folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and set it on the table. Then she sat in silence. For the first time in years, she didn't know what to feel. When she told Briggs, the young corporal just stared at her. "You're leaving." "Temporarily," Hawthorne said. "But the new instructor cycle will run fine without me. You'll assist Sergeant Collins, you're ready." Briggs frowned. "Ma'am, this place needs you." Hawthorne smiled faintly. "No, it doesn't. It just needs the next version of me. That's you." The girl looked down, swallowing the words she wanted to say. Then softly, "You always talk like you're preparing to disappear." Hawthorne paused. "In this line of work, you have to be okay with being forgotten. It means the mission went right." Briggs shook her head. "That's not true. You can't train people to fight for life and pretend you don't deserve one." Hawthorne met her gaze, surprised by the sharpness in her tone. Then she smiled small, proud. "You've been listening." 2 weeks later, she boarded the transport plane, duffel slung over her shoulder. No fanfare, no farewell ceremony. Just the low drone of engines, and a horizon fading into gray. Eastern Europe was colder than she remembered. Concrete buildings, sharp winds, and a constant hum of readiness. The advisory detachment was small, 20 operators from different branches, training local partners. It wasn't direct combat, but close enough to smell the gunpowder. The commanding officer, a major named Kravitz, greeted her with the clipped efficiency of a man who'd stopped being impressed by resumes. "Hawthorne," he said, scanning her file. "Special Operations Combatives, Ranger qualified. You'll handle close quarters instruction for Task Force 9. "Yes, sir." He looked up. "You've got quite a reputation. Let's see if it's earned." She gave a small nod. "It's not a reputation, sir. It's muscle memory." The days blurred together. Train, observe, advise. The unit was green but eager, their tactics rough around the edges. She taught them movement over strength, control over aggression, and precision over pride. Most respected her instantly. Some tested her, they always did. One evening, after a live exercise, a sergeant twice her size tried to prove a point. "Permission to challenge, ma'am." She sighed. "You really want that permission?" He grinned. "Yes, ma'am." 30 seconds later, he was flat on his back, gasping for air. She helped him up, same calm tone. "Permission to breathe." The team laughed, the lesson stuck. But it wasn't the training that kept her awake at night. It was the sound. Distant artillery, drills echoing from miles away. It wasn't war, not officially, just practice. But to her ears, it sounded like memory. At night, lying on her cot, she could almost smell the dust of Raqqa. Hear Collins shouting her name. Hear the click of an empty rifle and the silence that followed. She thought she'd buried that sound for good. She hadn't. One night after a training mission ran late, she found herself sitting alone outside the barracks, cold air biting at her skin. Her hands were steady until they were. The tremor came without warning, small but real. She clenched them into fists until it passed. A voice behind her broke the silence. "You ever sleep?" It was Captain Rains, another advisor, former Green Beret. calm, weathered, kind eyes. "Rarely," she said. He sat beside her on the steps. "You remind me of someone I used to know, same thousand-yard stare." "Let me guess," she said, "didn't end well." He shrugged. "Depends. He learned to stop fighting shadows." She smirked. "And how do you do that?" "You stop pretending they're enemies." She didn't respond, just watched her breath form clouds in the cold. After a moment, he added, "You've done good work here. The locals talk about you like you're a myth." She exhaled softly. "I'm tired of being a myth." "Then maybe it's time to be human again," he said. She wanted to laugh at that, but couldn't. A few days later, things went wrong. Not in the dramatic way, just fast, stupid, human. Joint patrol, civilian convoy training. A roadside explosion, small, improvised, uncontrolled. Not directed at them, but close enough. The shockwave hit before sound. The vehicle rocked, windows shattered. She was thrown sideways, shoulder slamming metal. When her vision cleared, chaos. One trainee down, bleeding from the arm, another frozen, smoke thick and acrid. She moved on instinct, tourniquet, compression, calm voice over panic. "Breathe, you're okay, stay with me." Same words, different war. By the time medics arrived, she was sitting on the ground beside the wounded soldier, her hands slick with his blood, her pulse steady. Rains knelt beside her. "You good?" She nodded once, functional. He gave a small smile. "That's not the same thing." She almost smiled back. "I know." Later that night, she scrubbed her hands raw in the sink. The water ran pink, then clear. She stared at her reflection in the mirror. Older, tired, still standing. For a long moment, she just watched the woman staring back. Then she whispered, "I'm still here." It wasn't pride, it was defiance. Weeks passed. The mission stabilized. Training continued. The explosion became just another story in a long list of near misses. But something inside her had shifted again, subtle, permanent. She realized she wasn't here to escape the past. She was here to learn to live with it. When the 6 months were nearly over, Rains found her packing in the barracks. "Heading home?" he asked. "Fort Liberty," she said. "Must feel good going back." She hesitated. "It's not about going back. It's about going forward, somewhere I actually know the ground." He smiled. "You ever think about staying stateside for good, teaching civilians maybe, writing? God knows people could learn from you." She shook her head. "What I teach doesn't belong in classrooms. It belongs in scars." He studied her, then said quietly, "Maybe that's exactly why you should teach it." The flight home was longer this time, not in hours but in weight. Every deployment added a layer, every return peeled one away. By the time she stepped off the plane, the air felt lighter. At Fort Liberty, the world had moved on, new faces, new classes, new laughter echoing down the halls. Briggs was now wearing instructor tabs. When she saw Hawthorne walking toward her, she froze, disbelief spreading into a grin. "Ma'am," she said, snapping to attention. Hawthorne waved it off. "Don't start that." Briggs laughed. "I heard about Eastern Europe. They said you pulled 3 people out under fire." "Exaggerated," Hawthorne said. "It was one, and technically it wasn't fire, just smoke." Briggs smiled. "You never change." "Maybe that's okay," Hawthorne said quietly. That night she sat alone in her office, the lights dim. Her nameplate glinted on the desk. SFCB Hawthorne, lead instructor, SOCP advanced. She traced the letters with her thumb, thinking of all the places her name had been written, reports, citations, commendations, and how none of them ever told the real story. The real story was here in the quiet, in the breath between drills, in the lives that went on because she'd once refused to quit. She pulled out a notebook from her duffel, blank, untouched. Then slowly she began to write. Not a report, not doctrine, just fragments, memories, lessons, the truth behind the myth. She wrote about fear as a compass, about violence as communication, about the cost of silence and the grace of control. She wrote about a foster home kitchen in Detroit, about a collapsed building in Raqqa, about a mat at Pendleton and the sound of laughter turning into awe. Hours passed unnoticed. When she finally stopped, dawn was bleeding through the blinds. She looked down at the pages, shaky handwriting, smudged ink, and smiled. It wasn't a legacy, not yet, but it was a start. Later that day, Briggs found her by the bleachers again. "Still can't sit still, huh?" the young corporal said. "Old habits," Hawthorne replied. Briggs sat beside her, holding a small folder. "Command wants to nominate you for the Instructor Excellence Award." Hawthorne groaned softly. "That's a punishment, not an honor." Briggs smiled, "Then consider it penance." They sat in silence for a while, the afternoon sun warming their shoulders. Finally Briggs said, "You know what they call you now, the Ghost Sergeant." Hawthorne raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because you disappear between deployments, and every time you come back, things change." Hawthorne chuckled. "Ghosts don't change things, they just remind people what's worth keeping." Briggs tilted her head. "And what's worth keeping?" Hawthorne looked out toward the horizon, where cadets were running drills, shouts carried by the wind. "Stillness," she said softly, "the kind you earn after you stop running." Briggs nodded slowly. "Then I hope you don't leave again." Hawthorne smiled faintly. "If I do, it'll be for the right reason this time." That night, as the base lights dimmed and the sky turned the color of steel, she walked the perimeter one last time. Her shadow stretched long across the asphalt. She thought of all the places she'd stood, all the battles, all the ghosts, and for the first time they didn't feel like weights. They felt like markers on a road that had led her here. She stopped at the edge of the training field, watching her students practice under the floodlights. Their movements were sharp, focused, confident. Briggs was leading them, voice steady, patient, firm. Hawthorne smiled, whispering to the wind, "That's it, that's the point." The night was quiet, calm, infinite. And somewhere between silence and breath, she realized, maybe peace wasn't something you found. Maybe it was something you taught. What does peace look like for a soldier who never stopped fighting? For Sergeant First Class Ben Hawthorne, it didn't come in the ways she expected. No ceremony, no medals, no applause echoing through hangars. It came quietly, like dawn sneaking through blinds after a long night. A slow return to breath. A soft moment of stillness. Months had passed since she'd returned from Eastern Europe. The world had moved on, as it always did. But this time she wasn't chasing it. She was content to let it move without her. Fort Liberty in spring felt different. The air smelled of cut grass and rain. The training fields glistened under the sun, dotted with young recruits moving through drills she'd once designed. From the instructor's tower, she watched them with quiet satisfaction. Briggs was leading the session now, her voice calm, firm, commanding in the way only earned confidence could be. "Eyes up," Briggs shouted. "Your environment's your first weapon." Hawthorne smiled, the cadence, the rhythm all hers. The student had become the teacher, and that, she thought, was the whole point. A voice behind her broke her thoughts. "Still can't resist watching from the shadows, huh?" It was Captain Rains, now back from Europe himself, visiting for evaluations. He leaned against the railing beside her, same easy calm, same sharp eyes. "Old habits die slow," she said. He chuckled. "You ever think about retiring? You've done enough for 10 lifetimes." She tilted her head. "Maybe, but I've got one more course to build before I disappear." He nodded. "Always one more mission." She smirked faintly. "Always." That evening she sat in her office, the same one she'd written in months ago, the notebook now half filled with scrawled lessons and reflections. She titled it simply, "The Quiet Fight." Every page carried a memory, not just hers, but borrowed fragments from those she'd trained. Notes about fear, resilience, discipline, redemption. She wasn't sure what she'd do with it. Maybe publish it someday. Maybe hand it to someone younger and let it live its own life. The knock at her door came soft. "Enter," she said. Briggs stepped in, holding a folder. "Ma'am, Command wants to nominate you for Master Instructor status." Hawthorne raised an eyebrow. That's what they give old instructors they don't know what to do with. Briggs smiled. "That, or they finally figured out how much you matter." Hawthorne leaned back, crossing her arms. "You've been practicing speeches again." "Just the parts I learned from you." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Briggs said quietly, "You changed my life, ma'am. You should know that." Hawthorne looked down, then up again, eyes softer. "No, you changed it yourself. I just gave you a place to start." Briggs hesitated, then handed her a small envelope. "Mail came for you, no return address." Hawthorne frowned, tearing it open carefully. Inside, a folded photo. 4 Marines, arms around each other, grinning in front of a combatives facility sign. Tours, Ramirez, Colt Park. On the back, scrawled in marker, "Still training, still learning. Thanks for the reminder." She stared at the picture for a long time, then smiled. Some debts didn't need words, just time. That night she walked the base perimeter again, her ritual since the beginning. The sky was deep blue, stars sharp and endless. The air hummed with the familiar rhythm of generators and distant drills. She passed the memorial wall one more time. Colin's name caught the light. She reached out, brushing it gently with her fingertips. "Still teaching me, aren't you?" she whispered. She closed her eyes. For years, that name had been a weight, the symbol of everything she couldn't save. But now it felt different. It felt like presence, like a hand on her shoulder saying, "You did enough." She let out a long breath. "I'm not running anymore," she murmured. "Promise." The next morning, before sunrise, she gathered her advanced class for a final session. They formed a loose circle under the floodlights, faces half-lit by the early glow. She stood in the center, the same place she'd stood 1,000 times. "Before we start," she said, "I want to tell you something." Every head turned. No one had ever heard her preface a drill like that. "When I started this job," she continued, "I thought my purpose was to prove something, to show people I belonged, that I could fight, survive, outlast. But that's not what strength is." She looked around the circle, meeting their eyes one by one. "Strength is patience. It's the quiet act of showing up when no one's watching. It's staying kind in a world that teaches you to harden." She paused. The silence was complete. Then she added softly, "Every time you step onto this mat, you're not fighting each other. You're fighting the parts of yourself that still doubt you. And when you finally win that fight, don't forget to rest." A few of them smiled. 1 or 2 looked like they might cry. She clapped her hands once. "All right, let's get to work." They trained until the sun rose fully, movements clean, precise, fluid. And for the first time in a long time, Hawthorne didn't correct anyone. She just watched. Because they didn't need her anymore. And that was the truest form of success. Weeks later, she finally took leave. No destination in the orders, just approved rest. She drove west until the air turned to salt again. California, the coast, Pendleton. She parked by the cliffs overlooking the Pacific, the same place where it had all begun. The waves below roared and shimmered like they had that day, years ago. She sat on the hood of her car, wind pulling strands of hair free from her bun. For once, she didn't fix them. Her phone buzzed, a message from Briggs. "Class finished early today. Used your quote, 'Violence is communication.' They got it." Hawthorne smiled, typed back, "Good, keep teaching them to listen." Then she set the phone aside, letting the sound of the ocean fill the space around her. She thought of everything that had led her here: Detroit, Syria, the mat, the blood, the laughter, the silence. Every piece of her story, stitched together by choice, by consequence, by endurance. And now, for the first time, she realized it had never been about proving herself. It had always been about showing others what survival could look like. She sat there until the sky turned gold. The wind carried the scent of salt and distance, the kind that makes you feel small but alive. She closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. In that moment, she didn't feel like a soldier. Not an instructor, not a survivor. Just a person who had finally learned how to stand still. A gull cried overhead, the waves rose and fell, and the sun climbed higher, soft and certain. She whispered to herself, "You made it." And maybe that was enough. Later that afternoon, she pulled a small envelope from her jacket, the one that held the photo of the Marines. She tucked it under a flat stone at the cliff's edge. No note, no ceremony, just quiet gratitude left for the wind to carry. She stood there for a while, watching the tide roll in, and finally said the words she'd carried her entire life. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The wind lifted her words and scattered them out over the sea. And for once, she didn't feel the need to chase them. That evening she checked into a small coastal motel. No rank, no uniform, no expectations. Just a name on a ledger, Bin Hawthorne. She slept with the window open, the sound of the ocean drifting in. And when she dreamed, it wasn't of battle or training or loss. It was of movement, water over stone, steady, patient, eternal. Because that's what she'd become. Not unbreakable, just unending. Days later, Briggs received a package in the mail, no return address. Inside, a single notebook, worn and handwritten. On the first page, in neat script, the title, "The Quiet Fight, Notes on Fear, Control, and the Grace of Stillness." And beneath it, one line written in blue ink. "If you're reading this, it's your turn to teach." Briggs smiled through tears, closing the book against her chest. Outside her window, recruits were forming up for morning PT, the sky still gray. She whispered, "Yes, ma'am." And somewhere far away, on a stretch of coastline washed in light, the sound of the waves rose like a heartbeat. Steady, calm, alive.